Hello, my name is Nicole Keller, and I am the instructor of organ at the Baldwin Wallace Conservatory of Music in Berea, Ohio, and I am also the associate organist at Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland. Today I want to talk to you about breathing in our hymn playing. And note that I said breathing in our hymn playing, not in our hymn singing, as we as organists tend to focus mostly on the playing, sometimes to the detriment of the singing. But it's important that we remember that the most important incarnation of a hymn is that it is sung. It is the living and breathing expression of the gathered congregation. The organ is the leader of the hymn, but it is also the servant of it. So we have to be very mindful that in everything that we do, we support and encourage the corporate song of the congregation. A hymn is a poem set to music. It has its own rhythm, it has its own meter, it has its own flow, and we either elucidate that or we obscure it by what we do here at the console. So we want to be very mindful of what we do when we play and keep a few certain aspects in mind. The first thing we want to remember is that the text is king of all. It is the reason for the hymn. It governs all of our choices that we make musically. I've chosen today for our example hymn, Praise to the Lord the Almighty, Lobe den Herren, a hymn we probably all know fairly well, and we probably have some fairly crystallized procedures of how we go about turning this hymn into a piece of music for our congregation to sing to. But I just want us to make sure that we're keeping a few things in mind. I have a fairly regular procedure of preparing hymns for worship. I have 3 steps. Step 1 is to read the text aloud and mark any breaths or breaks for emphasis. And I keep those in 2 very separate categories. A breath is a space that I take at the end of a thought, at the end of an idea, or at the end of a musical phrase. A break is a place where we may stop for emphasis, not necessarily stopping the beat, but stopping the sound. And a breath is often quite a bit bigger than a break, as we will see in this hymn here. So I read the text through so that I can see where I might want to take these breaks and breaths. It gives me an idea of the meaning of the text, of the meaning of the hymn within the service, and the general flow of the words and the rhythm. And it also helps me determine where my phrases are. So let's take a look at the first stanza of this hymn. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. All ye who hear, now to his temple draw near. Join me in glad adoration. So I'm already thinking about some places where I want to take some breaths and breaks. So in this first line, praise to the Lord the Almighty, I put a break there for emphasis before the King of creation, and then a hard breath. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. I could keep that all in one phrase and have a hard breath afterwards. All ye who hear, I breathe there. It's a long note. Now to his temple draw near, I breathe there. Join me in glad adoration, one long phrase with, of course, a breath at the ends of the stanza. And I think very carefully about how big those breaths are going to be, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So with every hymn, I would go through each stanza and make these marks. Many hymns are very similar from one stanza to another. This hymn only has 3 stanzas. The second is a bit different in some places, so I just want to make those marks here as well, because that's going to make a difference for us. Praise to the Lord, who o'er all things so wondrously reigneth, I'll breathe there. Shieldeth thee under his wings, break, yea, so gently sustaineth, breath. Hast thou not seen how thy desires e'er have been granted in what he ordaineth? That's really, really long. And likely your congregation is not going to be able to sing through it. I have some vocal training and I can't get all the way through that. So I'm going to decide first without singing that I'm going to take a break at the end of the 3rd line where we would normally take a break. and sing, but sing two long phrases together, and we'll see how that works when we get to the singing part of it. So then I would go through verse 3, stanza 4, and see what those stanzas bring to us. So I've gone in and I've made my markings. So now the next thing I want to do, step 2, is to sing the text with the markings. Singing it helps me determine if the markings actually make any sense, if the phrases actually make any sense. It also helps me decide on the tempo. The way we think about a piece as we play it is very different than the way we think about it as we sing it, because we have to create the sounds ourselves, and it takes just a little bit more energy. And it also helps us to decide how fast your congregation could sing as well. We do want to keep in mind that most congregations do not have trained singers in it. Some do, which is really a great thing. But you sort of want to plan for the least amount of training. That way everyone can sing together fairly well. So we'll find our G major here. So I'm not going to play, I'm going to sing first. First verse. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. All ye who hear, now to his temple draw near. Join me in glad adoration. So most of my breaths make sense to me. I like the places where I put the breaks in. They're not that hard to get in there. Sometimes singing through a long line without any breaks or breath in it can be a little bit difficult. I have to think about that a little bit more, which tells me that I need to make sure that my tempo isn't too slow for my congregation. I like this tempo. I think it allows enough time for breathing. This is a nice space. It's not a huge space that we're in. The sound is warm. The sound travels a little bit. It's not dead. So I don't want to play too fast so the sound doesn't swirl around so the congregation can't hear it. All right, so I've sung through that first stanza. My step 3, you would sing through all the stanzas, of course. Step 3 would be to play the hymn with your markings in the same tempo. I like to play and sing at the same time. It gives me an idea of how true I'm being to things. If you can't play and sing at the same time, that's okay. Go ahead and play it, but keep yourself in the same tempo. We have to think about how long those breaths are going to be. So we're in 3/4. There are 3 beats in every measure. The long breaths at the end of the systems, those notes are 3 beats long. And I always like to think about my breaths being a subdivision of your meter. So your breath is going to be either a quarter note or a half note or perhaps an 1/8 note, depending on how big you want it to be. And again, you'll have to determine that based on your tempo, based on the space in the room. We don't want to leave giant chasms between the notes, but we also don't want people gasping for breath in between stanzas trying to come in as well. I think I would like to try 1 beat of breath at the ends of the long phrases. And I think at the end, probably 1 beat of breath as well. Sometimes we hold that last note of the stanza a little bit longer to give it some finality, but I think 1 beat is fine. So let's try what this first verse is going to look like with 1 beat of breath, with my marks and my breaths. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. All right, so I needed a breath there in the middle of that second stanza. Could be just me, or I could need to push that just a little bit faster. And I took about 1 beat of breath at the end of the first line. And probably a good way to practice that would be to actually count it. So if I'm coming into that, into the end of that line, King of creation, 1, 2, 3, oh my soul, praise him for. And I would do that at the end of every line. Health and salvation. 1, 2, 3, oh, it's a good 2 beats with perhaps a bit of a pregnant third beat at the end of it, keeping in mind that the congregation is always slightly behind you in whatever you're doing. So I would want to go through each verse and do that. The second verse, remember, had a little bit of a different breath once we got to the middle of the hymn, right where we left off. The first verse is, but the second verse is, so I have this long note in between, and I really want to encourage the congregation to sing through that. One thing you should absolutely do is make sure that you're playing legato from one measure to the next. Don't break the sound at all. That will encourage them, hopefully, to continue singing. But if I want, I can add a little bit of activity during that blank time to fill up that space, which will hopefully also keep the rhythm and the flow going. So an easy thing I could do is add a little bit more activity in the pedal. That works just fine as well, keeps the movement going. Perhaps I want to be a little bit more creative and change my harmonies just a little bit. This also gives the congregation just a hint that you're going to do something a little bit differently, which isn't a bad thing. So let's try. So the minute they hear the change in the harmony, hopefully they're perking their ears up a little bit so that they're paying more attention to the text and paying more attention that's going on. I can be a little bit more daring in my harmony to keep that melodic line going through and keep the harmonic line going through as well. Because it's one long harmonic line that doesn't really come to its half cadence until the end, so I don't feel like I want to stop. And it's different enough than the first verse to really elucidate the text, so I like to do that. So I would go through every verse. One thing we didn't talk about yet is the end of the hymn and how long that breath should be in between stanzas. I'm going to treat it just the same as some of the inner breaths, with perhaps a larger third beat to give us just a little bit more time. Let's see what that feels like. Join me in glad array, 1, 2, 3, praise to the Lord. I like that. You could go a little bit longer, perhaps add an extra beat that takes us outside of our time signature, which is a little bit odd, I think. You could make the measure twice as long. That can be too long. So you kind of have to play around with it, sing it, play it, record it for yourself, play it for someone else, and see what they think. But that experimentation process, I think, is important. I like to mark this on my personal score, so I have an idea of what I was thinking. I like to mark my tempo at times as well on a score, just to keep yourself from going too fast. It's very easy. The more you get familiar with something, the faster it tends to go, because it just feels a little bit easier. So these are all very basic things about hymn playing, but I find going back to basics when we're thinking about the best way to lead a congregation is really important. We love to have fun as organists. We love to throw in lots of different harmonizations and lots of different embellishments and things like that, which are really, really great, but we have to be very mindful that the most important thing is that we provide the structure for the congregation to sing on top of. And the breath that you provide in there, those little bits of silence, those little bits of anticipation of what comes next, is what actually sets things apart in the text for the congregation. Be consistent, especially within one hymn. I treat all of my long breaths just about the same so that the congregation knows what to expect. They don't like being surprised in the middle of a hymn, we all know that. So try to be consistent with that and just set up a sort of structure for them to get used to. So I hope these little tips were helpful for you in rethinking your hymn playing and bolstering your hymn playing and encouraging your congregation to sing more, and most importantly, for us to remember that hymns are things to be sung, and it is our job to make that singing as easy as possible.